Welcome to the overview of the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework. The Enterprise Data Ethics Framework has very recently been endorsed by the Chief Information Officer at UQ and has come into effect in June 2021. Before we get into discussing data ethics, let's take a moment to review what ethics are. So ethics is the discipline that deals with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. Ethics is something that's taken quite seriously at UQ. You'll see ethics referred to in the likes of our UQ values and other key documents that really steer the work that we do as an organisation. Data ethics, therefore, are the moral standards that are applied when we work with data at UQ. The reason that we need an enterprise data ethics framework is to remove the ambiguity that exists from person to person, because moral standards or ethics often will vary quite considerably from individual to individual. These will be influenced on our own perspectives, experiences, belief systems, and even demographical factors like age. So rather than each of us relying on our own moral compass when we're working with data at UQ, we have developed an enterprise data ethics framework to provide clarity around what can and can't be done with data, to ensure consistency and accountability in decision making, and to foster trust among our wider UQ community, so our staff, our students, and everyone else, businesses, organisations, and individuals who interact with UQ. Data ethics are incredibly important to our business at UQ. Overlooking ethical considerations may introduce risks for both the organisation and for individuals. So, for example, reputational damage may be introduced if UQ is seen to use data in a way that is not considered acceptable by the wider community. Similarly, data subjects, or those who are described within the data, may be adversely affected even when there's the best of intentions going into a particular data use activity. For example, data analytics may reveal insight that is particularly personal and interferes with an individual's privacy, even if that wasn't the intent at the outset. Similarly, there are other data stakeholders that should be considered when we are using data at UQ. For example, learning analytics that look at teaching loads should consider more than just the relative number of courses that an academic may be delivering, and will also need to consider how much work goes into actually delivering that course. Otherwise, academics who may have a lower number of courses that take an awful lot of effort to deliver may be adversely affected if the data is misunderstood. The Enterprise Data Ethics Framework outlines 7 ethical principles that can be applied to how we work with data at UQ. It also provides guidance for applying these ethical principles. The framework also outlines some considerations that may apply throughout the information lifecycle, so the different stages, such as our planning phase, when we're storing data, and when we're sharing it with collaborators. It also provides us with a bit of an overview of the roles and responsibilities that ensure that we are accountable in our ethical use of data. It is worth noting that only data that is used for non-research purposes is within scope of the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework. The framework and supporting information can be found on the Data at UQ website, which is shown here on the screen, data.uq.edu.au/ethics. The development of the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework has been quite an involved process. It's taken roughly 12 months for us to draft and receive feedback on the framework. So when we commenced looking at what we wanted to do in the ethical data space, we considered existing legislation and UQ policies and procedures. We then moved on to review the relevant published and grey literature in this space, looking at both data ethics within the higher education context and more broadly, looking at key papers in the data ethics space in general. We also conducted an environmental scan of data ethics approaches at similar higher education institutions, mostly within Australia, but also looking at key organisations globally. We engaged with multiple key stakeholders and senior committees across UQ to obtain feedback and discuss concerns that related to the ethical use of data. We also conducted a staff survey, which was disseminated in January 2021 via UQ Update. Thank you to all who participated. Your feedback was taken on board and has informed the development of both this framework and training and supporting materials that we've put together. Stakeholder feedback on the draft framework was also very important to make sure that we were addressing concerns from within the UQ community and that our training materials also were appropriate. It's also worth highlighting the data sharing agreements that we have in place. So these were introduced roughly 12 months ago. A data sharing agreement is a form that outlines details about a proposed data use and what data is required for that use. It's an agreement between our information consumers, who are people who are using data for a given purpose, and our information stewards, who are the ones responsible for approving access and providing oversight for data that falls within their information domain. So data sharing agreements can apply for a variety of data use cases. These may include analytics for service improvement, the use of corporate data for research purposes. So data sharing agreements do apply for research, even though the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework doesn't, just to clarify. They also may be used for data integration into a new UQ system. It's worth noting at this point that business as usual activities do not necessarily fall within scope for data sharing agreements, such as a new team member coming to UQ. We wouldn't need a data sharing agreement to give them access to the folders where your working data as a team is stored. If ever you're in doubt of what data use may require a data sharing agreement, you can contact the Data Strategy and Governance team for advice. So to return to the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework, on this slide we have outlined our 7 ethical principles. So the framework provides a little bit more in-depth information. Shown here, we just have our sentence version of each of the principles, but the framework also provides additional context in a paragraph that describes how these principles can be applied and the range of considerations that are applicable for each. Please take the time to look at how these are described in the framework itself and make sure you understand what might be relevant in your work. Keep in mind that not all principles may be relevant to the work that you do. You can see here that both principles 3 and 5 relate to the use of personally identifying information or personal data. Things like informed consent and respecting a data subject's right to privacy are only relevant in situations where we're using personal data. Once again, there's a lot of information on this slide here. We've got the roles and responsibilities outlined. This table is taken directly from the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework, so please read through it there where you can see everything in detail. Of particular relevance to most people who will be watching this video, I'll draw your attention to the information steward, information creator, and information consumer roles. So we already went over what an information consumer and an information steward are, but an information creator is someone who is capturing or loading data into maybe a UQ system or service platform. So they're the ones who are responsible for ensuring that the data is correct, complete, and complies with our ethical principles at the time it is captured or entered. You'll also note that we have an ethics advisory group. This group was endorsed by USET back in October of 2020. It's got an advisory capacity only, so we can refer cases on a case-by-case basis to the ethics advisory group for a higher level of advice if required on considering ethical implications of how we work with data. So usually this will be a data sharing agreement is received, there are quite complex ethical issues, and the information steward would like someone else to provide their recommendations on what should be considered before the data sharing agreement is approved. So the ethics advisory group is invaluable in these kinds of situations. Here we have outlined our process for data collection. In the framework, we also have a process for data use, and you'll see that both are very similar. The process for data collection starts with the information creator here on the top left of the slide. So they're planning their data collection activity, what data they plan to collect and for what purpose. The next step is for them to sit down and consider any potential ethical issues that might arise during that collection process. They should be liaising with the relevant information steward to ensure that they are considering all relevant ethical considerations and that they're getting some kind of approval to proceed with this activity, because whatever data is collected will fall within the domain that this information steward is responsible for. So they really should be made aware before that data collection activity proceeds. The information steward will also take some time to consider the potential ethical issues before issuing their approval for that activity. Once approval has been granted, the information creator can commence the data collection activity. Moving on to the process for data use, you can see this looks incredibly similar to what we had on the last slide. Our information consumer this time, so the one using data, proposes a data use case. So this will outline what data they'd like to use and for what purpose. They will then also take the time to consider any potential ethical issues before completing a data sharing agreement. When this data sharing agreement is submitted, it comes through to the data strategy and governance teams, and it will be reviewed initially for completeness and to make sure that everything really has been considered. It is then sent through to the information steward for the particular information domain. Keep in mind that for complex analytics type use cases, there may be more than one information steward relevant to that data sharing agreement, and we will liaise with all of them. The information stewards will then review the data sharing agreements and consider all potential ethical issues. The information steward, once satisfied, will then issue their approval, and then the information consumer can proceed with their data use activity. We've also prepared a range of training and support materials to help provide you with a little bit more guidance on the implementation of the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework. So firstly, we've developed an Enterprise Data Ethics Handbook. So it provides a little bit more in-depth guidance around how each of the ethical principles from the framework can be applied. Next, we have an interactive data ethics assessment tool. So it's a survey-based tool that will ask you a series of questions about your activity that either uses or collects data, and it will provide a report at the end that outlines the things that you may not yet have considered, the relevant ethical considerations that might need a little bit more consideration before you proceed. Finally, we have a hub on our Data at UQ website for using data ethically. So not only will you find the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework on this website and the handbook, you'll also find links to our staff development training and additional resources that we have prepared. If you feel that you need any additional support than what is provided here, you are welcome to contact the Data Strategy and Governance team directly to discuss either an individual use case or what support that you feel you need. So here's a bit of information about the Data Strategy and Governance team. You can email us directly at datagovernance@uq.edu.au and find us online at data.uq.edu.au. Please feel free to reach out to us directly via email if you need any support or advice on any matters that involve working with data at UQ.